So let me summarize a couple of the findings from that. The first is that the percentage of null findings, being the primary outcomes, increases dramatically with registered reports compared to other articles published in the same journals. So what you see here in the traditional literature, the standard way of peer review, is about 10% of this sample of articles had negative results. Almost all the results were positive results, which is a standard finding that's pervasive across many subdisciplines. With registered reports in those same journals, about 60% of the findings were negative, no results, regardless of whether they were replication studies or novel investigations. This right here is the demonstration of addressing publication bias. Very few negative results reported when you're reporting after the fact. When you don't know what the results are going to be, a very high proportion of negative results. So we would presume that already that makes the research literature itself more credible based on reporting what's actually happening in research. But when we show these results, there are some editors that react and say, well, this is a reason for me not to offer registered reports at my journal, because people don't like negative results and they won't cite them as much. And then I will be the one that reduced the impact factor of my journal. And that is not something I really want to do. And while we might not agree with impact factor as a rationale for why, how someone should make decisions about how a journal operates, nevertheless, it is in the air. There's lots of interest and concern about impact factor, prestige of outlets, and potential citation rates. And so it's worth at least investigating as a scholarly matter whether register reports does shift citation rates. And our preliminary evidence suggests that it doesn't, or at least it doesn't in the direction that people worry. What you're seeing here is an analysis of an initial set of registered reports that were published, I think, between 2014 and 2017. And their citations compared to other articles published in the same journals at the same time. And we looked in 3 different databases: Google Scholar, Scopus, and Web of Science. And 100 indicates that the registered reports were cited about the same amount as the comparison articles. And above 100 would indicate that registered reports were cited more frequently than comparison articles. So we would interpret this as evidence that there isn't really any difference. If anything, registered reports are getting cited slightly more compared to other articles in these same journals. Now, an obvious caveat for both of these is that this is preliminary evidence, not comprehensive evidence after doing this for many years. So we'll need to replicate these findings themselves. We also don't know the extent to which, as these spread across different subdisciplines, whether there'll be variation in the likelihood of these things occurring by subdiscipline. But they are at least initial evidence suggesting that some of the goals of what register reports should do and their potential impact are not negative. In fact, if anything, they are quite positive. Now, we can only speculate why citation rates themselves, even when most of the findings are negative results, are as high or even higher. I think there are 2 primary reasons, and these are speculations, for why this is the case. The first is that if everyone agrees in advance, editor, reviewers, the authors, we need to know the answer to this, then any outcome is meaningful. Right? We don't know the results, but we want to know the results. Then a negative result is actually information that we care about. The second factor, excuse me, is that the review happens at a point in time where critical feedback about problems with the methodology can actually improve the methodology. In the standard approach for research, when I write up the final report and get my reviews back and the reviewers point out all of these things I did wrong in the research, all I can do is feel bad. The studies have already been done. Money's been spent. All of the work is behind us. And so I have to then just revise it, hope that the next round of reviewers don't care about that as much or don't notice it or whatever, so that it can get published. In register reports, when the reviewers identify weaknesses in the methodology, often I can say, oh, that's a good point. Let's change the methodology so that we don't have that particular issue come up. So it may, in fact, improve the rigor of the research as compared to when we don't get that critical expert feedback at the right point in time where it's actionable. So that's actually part of the basis of our next evaluation that we released just this past month as a preprint, where we evaluated 29 registered reports compared to comparison articles that were in the same topic, published in the same journal around the same time, or were on a similar topic published by the same authors, either the first or corresponding senior author, published around the same time. And what we did was we took two articles and then we matched the register report and then randomly selecting one of the two comparison articles. And we gave those to peer reviewers in that substance area to do reviews of the papers. We removed indications of whether they were registered reports or not, but it's not so hard for some of these to be able to guess. And so we do have information about how many people guessed which one is a registered report or not, and then how much that qualified these findings. Happy to talk about that in discussion. But the core goal was to get peer reviewers to evaluate the quality of these papers on 19 outcome criteria, and then whatever qualitative responses they wanted to provide. Some of those outcome criteria were rated before they knew the study outcomes. So we sort of split up the papers where they would read the intro, the first experiments, if there were any initial experiments, and then the methodology of the final study that was the registered report. And then they had to evaluate that methodology and all the prior stuff. Then we would show them the results and discussion of that final study, and then they would evaluate it. And then they would read the abstract and the final material and rate the paper as a whole and give 4 more ratings. So here is the results of this investigation. So this is these are Bayesian credible intervals for the distributions, and it was done with a mixed model. And what you're seeing here is anything in the positive values is registered reports outperforming the comparison articles. Anything to the left of the dotted line or negative values is the comparison articles outperforming registered reports. And what you can see very quickly across all criteria is that none of the estimates were to the left of the line. In no cases on any outcome did the comparison articles outperform registered reports. Registered reports perform better from very strongly things like methodology rigor, the quality of the methods, to modestly, like creativity of the methods or the novelty of the research question. But in all cases, before they knew what the outcomes were, after they knew the outcomes, how rigorous was the analysis, how justified were the conclusions, what's the quality of the results and the discussion, how much did we learn, even when their negative results are higher in registered reports compared to the comparison articles. And then after finishing the whole paper, people rated consistently the registered reports as higher quality papers, that the discoveries themselves were more important, and that the authors aligned better the findings that they have with how they present those findings in the paper itself. So again, we're at preliminary evidence, right? This is 29 papers. It is not all possible registered reports in all possible domains. It is partly contingent on the comparison articles that we selected, but it is nevertheless very encouraging evidence that in fact, this conceptual idea translates into improved quality of research at the output. Now, some obvious follow-up things to do besides doing this kind of study, again, with a broader range of research, is to evaluate whether the findings are actually more reproducible or credible themselves in registered reports versus comparison articles, right? Can we reproduce the findings? When you do replications, are they more likely to replicate? And to do a randomized trial of registered reports versus the comparison articles. Right, because this was not a randomized trial. We selected and matched rather than randomly assigned people to do this. It's tricky to do a randomized trial, but we have a proposal out to do a randomized trial in those subfields where it's common in a revise and resubmit at a journal for the editor to ask for an additional experiment. And so that's where we're going to do the intervention. We have a few dozen journals that are signed on to doing this randomized trial if it's funded, where when you get a revise and resubmit asking for an extra experiment, then we invite authors to be randomly assigned to the registered report. They get the review of that experiment beforehand or the traditional way of just doing the experiments and then reporting it later. So we're eager to pursue that research to further push the boundary on this, this approach to peer review. Well, I want to say one more thing about it before closing for some discussion, and that is, as you're thinking about the register report model, it's very easy to say that sounds a lot like the grant review model, because you're evaluating whether to give grant awards based presumably on the research not yet having been done. So what this presents as an opportunity is, again, going back to that system of rewards, is aligning the reward systems across multiple stakeholders simultaneously. So we can get a funder and a journal to offer a registered report model in tandem simultaneously. And about 6 of these have been done so far, and we just got funding from NSF to do an evaluation of these with a number of funders. So over the next few years, a group of funders will be initiating these to help facilitate some evaluation of whether they're effective at shifting research cultures in the subdomains that they operate. So the basic idea is that authors develop their registered report proposal with a budget for how much it's going to cost. They submit it to a single review process. If it passes the review process, the journal commits to publishing it, the funder commits to funding it. In the trials that we've done of this so far, everybody likes it. There's no one that dislikes this, right? Authors are say, wait, I submit one time and I get the publication and the money? Yeah, sign me up. Journals say, oh, I get high quality research coming to our journal for peer review. Of course, why wouldn't we want to be involved in that? And funders say, you know what, we get zero return on investment of a huge proportion of the research that we fund. It's never published at all. No one ever benefits from it. So to have a process where we get high commitment from the authors to actually publish the work, regardless of its outcome, is a way to dramatically improve our return on our research investments. And so it's easy for them to see the value of this too. And all of it, we presume, will have those salutary benefits of improving the quality, the rigor, the reproducibility of the research at the output. So that will be part of the longer term evaluation. Okay, so all of that is to say that there are many factors that are needed to help facilitate a culture change toward the values that we already have. Now, over the last 10 years, many different actors have been developing services, products, repositories, new policies, new initiatives to help promote culture change within their communities. And the collective impact of that is very strong. We have direct data for the services that we host, but I suspect if you have had other service providers provide their data, it would look very similar to this. So just to illustrate how much change is occurring over time, here is a plot of the number of registered OSF users of the Open Science Framework from when we released it in 2012 to the projection at the end of this month, approaching 300,000, obviously nonlinear growth. Likewise, those researchers are registering studies at accelerating rates, and we're approaching 60,000 by the end of this year of study registrations on the OSF. And it isn't just research producers that are using the OSF. There's also that research is getting consumed at increasing rates by the research community, the data that they're posting, the materials that they're sharing, et cetera. Just in 2020, researchers are projected to share or post about 3.8 million files on the OSF. Not all of those, because you don't have to make things public until you're ready or able to make things public, but a substantial portion of those have been made public, 1.6 million. And consumers have done 33 million downloads, or will have done by the end of the year, and approaching over 4 million. I think we actually just passed 4 million visitors to the OSF to consume that content. So again, this is one platform of many different services that are providing similar kinds of things to try to help make open science possible to do and easy to do, and support those norms, incentives, and policies that are being pursued elsewhere in the system. So let me close in just reminding us back to that systems level consideration of culture change. is rooted in our local environments. What we do locally is how this system changes. But we have to have in consideration of that the systemic pressures that are present in multiple different agents that are influencing individual researchers' behaviors. And successful culture change requires solving one of the most challenging problems, which is the coordination problem. Because these actors are independent, getting the system to shift requires coordinating among them, is getting institutions to adapt on how it is they decide who to hire and who to promote, while simultaneously getting publishers and funders to shift their systems for how it is they promote those things. And the grassroots work that you and us collectively are doing to try to help promote these new behaviors makes it easier and easier and easier for those top-down systems to make changes, because they see they work, they see they're happening, and they see that the community is in fact demanding them, that they're not imposing a new system. So thank you everybody for the work that you are doing, and I'm delighted to close and have some questions and discussion. If you want any follow-up on any of this, here are links that you can pursue. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that fantastic talk. There were a lot of really positive comments coming through, and a lot of thanks to you for giving us such a great amount of information here. I'm going to just go through some of the questions if you have a few minutes. The first one that got the most votes, so thanks to all of you for submitting questions and also voting on them, is can you comment on whether journals are checking the quality and usability of open data? Often when this questioner clicks through to examine them, the data is either unusable or it's in a format that can't be actually accessed.
Yeah, great question. So as a broad response, a lot of the way that culture change is enacted is first getting people to do the behavior and then getting them to do it well, right? If the barrier to entry of doing open data is so high that it all has to be fair standard, it all has to do these things, it all has to be structured in this way, then it makes it harder and harder for people to start doing the behavior in the first place. So in a lot of these movements, we are seeing exactly what the concern is expressed, is that the initial evidence is that, wow, we're not actually very good at sharing data. Yeah, we put our data online, but it's all in a PDF and it's, you know, rows from the Excel spreadsheet, or it's not coded in any way that we can be interpreted. That is going to happen and is happening regularly. And part of what is important about the movement is that the early adopters, or those innovators, are always we need them to be visible and a few steps ahead of showing how it can be done really well, to then bring the mainstream along to doing it better and better and better over time. So journals, for example, some journals offering badges have had it just be a self-designation, right? They have a very lightweight review process, which is me as an author, I say, I do have my data shared, here's a link to it. And the journal does a spot check. They follow the link, they look and see, does that look like the data? It looks like the data, okay. And then the responsibility is on me as claiming that I've done it and affirming that I've done it. And then for me to get the badge. So that is a way that is feasible for journals in workload to start to offer it, but then increases the risk of potentially unusable data and other things like the question described. There are some journals that are upping their expectations and actually doing reviews or asking reviewers to look at that content. It's not clear yet how scalable that is, or how much that will be done, or whether the system ultimately will need to have external validation, meaning that, yeah, the initial statement of my data are open might not be evaluated, but the accountability rests with me. And if independent actors say, oh, it turns out this data is not usable, and they submit that to the journal, then the badge, for example, might be revoked. So how it is that system plays out in terms of quality control and accountability at the end state is not yet worked out. What we have now is the seed data of where it's working, where it's not, where people are following through with these behaviors, and either need help or we need to work on the gaming that people will do to try to get the reward, the badge or whatever, and not actually do the behavior. So those are key issues, I think, for the open science movement in terms of meta science evaluation to understand where the limits are, and then continuing innovation of how can we incrementally up the ante for getting the behaviors to be as high quality as possible. So thanks for that question. It's a critical issue.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that wonderful answer. The next question that we have is, what would you say are the most important steps that institutions can take to promote a more transparent research culture?
Great question, and a hard one to answer. So on the transparency, institutions have an interesting challenge in general, which is the most senior level positions in institutions tend to be reluctant to impose policies that apply on how scholarly research gets done because they have the broadest array of disciplines represented within their institution. Right? It's not like a society where the kind of work and how the work gets done can be relatively narrow. Institutions represent the breadth. And so imposing singular standards is very difficult at an institutional level. It's not impossible, but it is difficult. And institutions tend to be careful about policy introductions in that way. Transparency is a little bit easier than others because there are shared standards that can be applied. It might vary in terms of what transparency means in scholarly disciplines, but the expectation for transparency and how one then articulates how they are meeting that goal or value in promotion review or otherwise can be instantiated at an institutional level. So more specifically, I think the keys at institutions is to look at how is it that we manifest the evaluation systems of reward at hiring, the key points, right? Hiring and promotion review. At those two locations, there are very specific things that happen intentionally and unintentionally that can undermine the focus on transparency, credibility, quality, reproducibility. So I'll give a quick example. I went up for full professor a few years ago at my institution, and my department administrator, when I was preparing my materials, said, print out all of your articles and submit them for the committee's review. Right? First of all, printing them out, like, are you crazy? Second was, you want all of my articles? She said, yes. I said, I have 100 articles. This is going up for full professor. You want all of them? Yes, that's the rules we have. That message completely undermines the ideal that my department and my institution does have, which is a focus on quality, not on quantity, because they're not going to read 100 articles. They might weigh 100 articles, but they're not going to read them. So the implicit, not so implicit message to me is volume is what counts. What they could have done is the day I walk in the door, they say, when you go up for promotion, you're going to submit 3 articles. And we're going to read those articles. We're going to share those articles with other experts, have them read them to evaluate the quality of your work. You're going to pick which 3, but we're going to go in depth in 3. Just that change would change for me my understanding of what does it mean to be successful in this institution. Right? What do I need to do? I need to produce a few great things. Of course, I'm going to produce more because who knows which ones will really bubble up to be great things. But I need to produce a few great things rather than just churn out salami slice as many papers as possible so that when I wheelbarrow it into my department administrator, they say, great, all right, thanks for that. So thanks for that question.
Brian, thank you so much. That is a really great answer. And I certainly agree that changing tenure and promotion standards is the #1 way that institutions really need to work on changing values. We do have several more questions, but I know it's technically time for you to leave. Do you have time for one more question, or do you need to head out?
No, I am happy to do it. So no child has run in behind me demanding attention. So let's go.
All right, sounds good. We have a great question about registered reports. There seems to be a lot of interest in the questions about those. And one of the questions is, how can they be introduced into a field where they're not currently used? What kinds of things do you have to do in order to talk to journals that are in those disciplines in order to get them to persuade them that registered reports would be a good thing for them?
Great question. So the key way to start, I think, is get a progressive editor willing to do a special issue. So this is how we did it with the very first issue of Registered Reports, which was a journal, Social Psychology. It was published in 2014, but the proposal was in 2012 to say, here, let's try this. It'll be fun to try it. And the editor said, yeah, let's go for it. We'll see what happens. So that willingness for a single editor to do an experiment in a field where it hasn't been done before can make a massive difference because it becomes a proof of concept. It's possible. We can identify people in this research community that are willing and interested to try it out. And we'll get some evidence about whether it actually works or what things don't work in doing it. So that model has worked very well because it also can be relatively low commitment for the editors, right? It's just a special issue. You're not adopting this full scale. And in fact, I'll even volunteer to be the guest editor to do it. And so all of that stuff is very useful. There's also now a ton of material on OSF. There's a Registered Reports OSF project, and there's a group called Registered Reports Now, which is a number of different people who have been doing this outreach with editors to try to gain adoption in their fields. So you should go to that group and get the materials that are there. If you email me or if you go to the Twitter, Reg Reports is the Twitter handle, you can get involved in this group and get some materials for how to start to do the outreach with editors in your field to get some adoption. But please do it. Once you start, it's hard to stop.
That is a really great suggestion. Thank you so much. We have a couple of related questions that I'm going to jump to, just also about registered reports. And one is around whether or not this would actually open researchers up to being scooped. And another one is about one of the other areas I've heard some criticism around is around exploratory research. And I was hoping you could comment on both of those aspects.
Yeah. These are the key issues. So thanks for bringing them up. So scooping. So it's certainly possible in the same way that it's possible with grant reviews. So the people will know about the work that you're planning to do before you've completed it. Perhaps they could take it and run with it. That happens in grant reviews as well with external reviewers. And there are strong normative standards against treating that as a private correspondence and decision process for whether to fund it and then letting that person do the research. Likewise with the registered report. So it has the same level of protection as grant reviews does. But there also is an additional level of protection from that with registered reports. And that is once your registered report is accepted, you can't be scooped because you are going to get that publication even if someone else races and does it first. And once you get accepted, the norm with registered reports is then you submit it to the OSF. There's osf.io/rr is where people go and submit their accepted registered reports. And then that's public. Or you can embargo it, I think, if you don't want it to be public. But you can make it public so that it's very clear that you are doing this work and you're the one that originated it. This is one of the actual ironic advantages of early transparency is that it provides the verifiable evidence that it was your idea first, or that you had captured that area before someone else did. And so that same is true with preprints in establishing priority. The second question was, now I'm blanking on what you had asked me on the second one. Oops, you're muted still.
Sorry, exploratory research.
Oh yes, okay. So exploratory work. So registered reports is it's about that initial pre-commitment. So it's what are the planned analyses that you're going to do, but they do not restrict on doing exploratory analysis once you've gotten the findings. So the way that a results section is structured in registered reports is here are my planned analyses. And then here's the stuff we discovered afterwards, right? I was totally wrong about this, or, oh, this thing went sideways. Here are the 15 things that we analyzed and that we think might be going on and why it is we observe that. So the value there is to embrace that both of these are important but also make really clear when we went off of our plans and into exploratory mode. That isn't enough for the other part of exploratory work, which is very common in my lab, which is that it starts very exploratory, right? We're not really ready to do a registered report because we don't really have a whole lot of plans other than this feels kind of interesting. Let's see where it goes. So registered reports is not a panacea that will cover every kind of research activity. It really is designed as most appropriate for when you do have a plan. And it could still be exploratory. I have a question, I have no idea, there's lots of possible outcomes, but I know how to analyze my data. That's a perfectly appropriate application of a registered report. But we also want to make sure that we don't lose what is the value of entirely out there, let's see what happens kind of work, as long as we know that it's that kind of work.
Thank you. If you have a moment, I have one more question that got a lot of votes, which is, can you discuss the tension between preserving protected health information and open data? And do you have any ideas for doing that responsibly, for actually sharing PHI?
Yeah, great question, because it is like the quality question on open data, which is it's going to be, a lot of this stuff is actually hard. And so the initial goal is to change the default to open, not to make everything open, but make it that the default assumption is that we would share it. And then what the journal does, if I can't share, but the journal requires me to share, then what I do in my cover letter is say, this is private data because of intellectual property issues or because of these particular sensitivity issues. And this is why I can't share it. And then they would make an assessment of, am I just being obstinate, or is that a legitimate reason to not follow the default? We handle this all the time in lots of areas for defaults. So that's a very manageable problem perspective. But there are also technical innovations that can still help to meet the goals of openness or transparency while still protecting some of those issues where there is real sensitive data. So for example, data enclaves have emerged so that researchers who want to verify findings on data that can't be shared openly can submit their analyses and then have the results returned without ever actually having the data themselves. And there might be some data that's so sensitive that even that process might ultimately be able to reveal some individually identifying information or information that's too sensitive. So there's actually research communities that have been building in error and finding ways to mask the data, even in the analysis outputs, that does not undermine the underlying covariance matrix or the inferences that we would draw, but does disguise the data sufficiently so that you wouldn't get this, like, for example, the exact same result each time that you went into the analysis. So that's very much on the horizon, but what it's suggesting is that there are incremental ways between the boundaries of fully open and fully closed that can still meet the goals of verifiability, of access, of sharing, et cetera, for openness. So thanks for that question.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions, but I think what we're going to do is send them to you via email, and then potentially you could respond to them if you have the time and opportunity. I appreciate that you're already staying with us a little extra time here.
No problem.
I really want to thank you. Brian may not remember this, but I've been trying to get him to keynote this conference since my first one in 2015. And so I'm so happy that you were finally able to join us and that the timing worked out. And this truly was a fantastic keynote, and we all are very appreciative for your time.